The morning of June 11th, 945, began like any other in the Drevlian capital. Gray skies over wooden walls, smoke from breakfast fires curling into dawn's pale light. Children played between the stockade's shadow and gardens their parents had tended for generations. Farmers hauled grain through gates that had never fallen. They never saw her coming. Queen Olga stood on the distant ridge with 5,000 men arranged behind her, but these weren't soldiers. They were architects of agony, masters of a craft older than nations. Each carried not swords, but clay vessels sealed with wax and prayer. Inside each pot, the concentrated hatred of a woman who'd watched her husband murdered, who'd buried nobles alive beneath her feet, who'd burned 20 men in a bathhouse for daring to negotiate her future. The Drevlians spotted the column as it descended, a purple-clad figure leading what appeared to be an honor guard. Their scouts had reported only a small embassy approaching. By the time they recognized their mistake, by the time the gates began to close, the first vessels had already shattered against Korostan's wooden walls. What poured forth wasn't fire as they understood it. This flame crawled like living things, seeking flesh with unnatural hunger. The vessels contained more than oil. They held the essence of every wrong ever visited upon the innocent, distilled and weaponized. Where it touched, men didn't simply burn. They melted. 5,000 warriors, 5,000 fathers and sons, 5,000 men who'd laughed at the idea of female vengeance, discovered that some fires consume more than bodies. From her vantage point, Olga watched the city die in sections. First the outer homes where screams began as questions, then the granaries where panic spread faster than flames, finally the great hall where they'd planned to make her their slave. She never looked away. Not when children ran with their clothes burning. Not when mothers threw themselves into wells to escape what she'd unleashed. Not when the king who'd orchestrated her husband's death appeared on the battlements, his crown glowing white-hot against his skull. This was the day that birthed a legend, the moment when grief crystallized into something sharp enough to carve kingdoms. History remembers her as Saint Olga, but on this morning, she was something else entirely, a woman who'd learned that mercy was just another word for weakness, and that some debts could only be paid in ashes. The wind carried the stench first. Weeks before the flames, before the screaming, before the queen's name became a curse whispered in every tavern from here to the coast, weeks before all that, the wind brought the smell. Rotting fish and sulfur, thick as wool in the lungs, clinging to the back of your throat like guilt. Villagers on the riverside said it was just the marshes. They were wrong. Rumors had already begun to curl like smoke through the taverns of Vireland. The queen had vanished. Not fled, not captor, gone. As if the earth itself had opened its maw and swallowed her whole. For 3 nights, the sky above the capital had bled red. Not the soft crimson of dusk, but the violent, arterial spray of something dying. Priests locked their temple doors. Mothers tied iron nails to their children's ankles. In the alleys behind the butcher's quarter, a boy claimed he saw her shadow walking without her body. No one laughed. She had ruled for less than a decade, but her reign had been carved in scars. They called her Queen Serafini the Severe, though never to her face. She wore black velvet like mourning, even in summer. Her voice, low and deliberate, could still a rune faster than a drawn blade. Under her rule, the kingdom had grown rich and cold. Borders closed. Markets thrived under heavy tariffs and heavier guards. Spies slept in every attic. And always, the smell of smoke. No one knew where she came from. Not truly. One day she was a bastard daughter of a forgotten duke. The next she wore the crown like it had been forged for her skull. The old king died quietly, too quietly. A hunting accident, they said. The kind where the arrow enters the back of the neck and exits through the eye. Her coronation was held in the dead of winter. The rivers froze that day. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, their wings stiffened mid-beat. No one cheered. They were too busy shivering. She never smiled. Not once. Courtiers tried everything. Jugglers, poets, a man who claimed he could breathe fire. She watched them all with the same expression, like she was already picturing their funerals. Her own council feared her. Not because she shouted, but because she never had to. When Lord Halric suggested she marry for alliance, she simply stared at him until he excused himself and was later found drowned in his own wine cask. No one suggested anything again but the men, those 5,000 men, they had been hers once. Soldiers, mercenaries, and desperate souls who swore the oath beneath her banner. They marched north to crush a rebellion. They never returned. Not alive. Not whole. Not in any way that made sense. And now, as the marshes bubbled and the sky bled and the wind carried that sweet, sickening stench of burning flesh, the whispers began to change. Not vanished, they said. Not gone. Awakened, and she was coming back. Not for her throne. Not for justice. But for the kind of reckoning that doesn't end until the ground is ash and the rivers boil. Fire remembers. The stench of burning flesh drifted across the valley like a hellish fog, carrying with it the screams of 5,000 men who had once marched beneath the banners of the Iron Host. Their commander, Lord Blackmere, sat astride his warhorse at the rear of the column, too far to save them, close enough to watch every second of their agony. The first flames had erupted from the ground itself, great geysers of fire bursting through hidden vents beneath the packed earth where his soldiers stood in form. Asian. Men who'd survived a dozen campaigns died clawing at their own faces as the heat melted the very air from their lungs. Queen Morwyn stood alone atop the ancient watchtower of Caer Drakemore, her midnight cloak whipping in the wind that fed the Inferno below. In her right hand she clutched the Crimson Seal, a relic older than the kingdom itself, its ruby surface now glowing with the same unholy light that danced across the battlefield. The artifact hadn't been used in 3 centuries, not since her great-grandmother had turned back the Eastern Horde. But Morwyn had learned its secrets from the crumbling journals she discovered in the castle's forbidden archives, written in blood by the very mages who'd forged it in the depths of Mount Pyrrhus. Each pulse of crimson light that emanated from the seal corresponded to another pocket of earth erupting beneath the invading army. The ground had become a living thing, a monster of stone and flame that devoured everything it touched. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran, only to find themselves trapped between walls of fire that rose higher with every heartbeat. Their armor, once symbols of invincible strength, became coffins of molten metal that cooked them alive from the inside out. Lord Blackmere's warhorse reared in terror as the heat reached even the command position, its eyes rolling white with primal fear. Through the shimmering air, he could see the silhouette of the woman who'd orchestrated this nightmare, a solitary figure outlined against the blood-red sky, her long black hair streaming like war banners in the infernal wind. This wasn't the broken queen he'd expected to find, the desperate monarch who'd barricaded herself in her dying kingdom's last stronghold. This was something else entirely, something that had shed its humanity like a snake sheds its skin. The Crimson Seal grew hotter in Morwyn's grasp, burning its shape into the flesh of her palm, but she felt no pain. All she felt was the power rushing through her veins like liquid fire, the intoxicating knowledge that every man who'd come to pillage her kingdom would die screaming beneath her walls. Her reflection in the seal's surface showed eyes that had turned the color of fresh blood, pupils dilated to black voids that reflected nothing human. Below, the screams had begun to fade as the last pockets of resistance were swallowed by flame, until only the crackle of burning flesh and the hiss of superheated air remained. The execution ground stank of fear before the torches ever touched pitch. 5,000 men knelt in rows that vanished into the morning mist, their wrists raw from hemp rope, their breath forming small white clouds above the mud. King Roderick's soldiers, once the finest in the realm, now looked like broken toys dropped by a careless child. Most stared at the ground. A few whispered prayers to gods who had clearly clocked out early. At the center of this human ring stood Queen Elira, still in her blood splat. Red riding leathers, hair unbound and crackling with dried gore. She had not slept, had not changed, had not blinked since the walls of Hymir cracked open at dawn. In her right hand she carried the same torch she had wrenched from a gatehouse bracket hours earlier. The pitch-soaked rag at its head dripped black tears onto her boots. Behind her, 50 barrels of oil waited like obedient hounds. She had ordered them rolled from the palace cellars personally, supervising every bung, every spigot, until the air itself tasted flammable. A hush rippled outward when she raised the torch. Prisoners who had cursed her name moments before fell silent, as if death itself had just cleared its throat. Elira's voice, when it came, was soft enough that only the front ranks could hear, and every man leaned forward against his bonds to catch the words. You sacked my city while I watched from the battlements. You dragged my little sister through the streets like a banner. You thought I would bargain. She lowered the torch until the flame licked the rim of the nearest barrel. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then blue fire raced along the oil's surface, snapping outward in liquid lightning. The first screams rose before the heat touched flesh, anticipatory, animal, already mourning skin that was still intact. The queen stepped back. Flames rolled across the field in perfect, disciplined lines, following channels her engineers had carved before sunrise. Where the fire met flesh it hissed, a sound like rain on a hot skillet. Men tried to stand, to run, but the ropes held and the ranks behind pressed forward, turning the formation into a slow, crushing mill. Smoke boiled upward in greasy black pillars, carrying the stench of rendered fat and scorched iron. Above it all, carrion birds wheeled and shrieked, too impatient to wait for the dying to finish. Elira watched without expression. In the orange glow her eyes looked wet, though whether from smoke or sorrow no witness could swear. She had ordered her own musicians to stand nearby. When the screaming reached its crescendo, the drums began, slow and deliberate, each beat matching the thud of her heart. History would call this the burning of the 5,000. Survivors, there were none, would have called it judgment. The queen simply called it payment, and when the last torch guttered out, she dropped it into the ashes, turned, and walked back toward the palace whose foundations now drank blood like a thirsty stone. The stench of charred flesh clung to the sandstone walls for 3 seasons after. Caravanserai whispered that the wind itself carried blackened scraps of banners across the dunes, each thread still whispering the names of the 5,000. In the inner sanctum of the Sun Palace, Rani Vigilata never once asked for the tally of dead. She had watched the first torch arc through the Preton darkness and known the mathematics of vengeance by heart. By noon, her city had become a furnace. Oil-soaked logs, stacked 20 deep between the palace gates and the merchant quarter, roared louder than any war drum. Enemy soldiers, some barely old enough to grow beards, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the killing lanes. When the flames caught their silk tunics, the dye turned violet, then black, then nothing. Their screams braided with the crackle of cedar until the two sounds were indistinguishable. Court chroniclers tried to scrub the details later, claiming the earth drank their ashes. Liars! The earth rejected them. For weeks afterward, gray snow drifted over rooftops, flakes of human fat that hissed when they touched wet stone. Children who chased the cinders developed coughs that rusted their lungs. Physicians fled. Even the grave diggers bartered for passage east, terrified that the dead might demand company. Inside the Zanana, Rani Vigilata bathed in chilled rosewater while her ministers begged for mercy. One trembling voice reminded her that Dharma forbade killing those who had thrown down their swords. Without turning, she flicked water from her fingertips onto the marble. The droplets steamed. "Mercy," she murmured, "is a coin I spent the day They murdered my sons on this same flagstone. Night brought no relief. The pyres smoldered, low and sullen, painting the sky the color of liver. Across the river, widows of the 5,000 lit smaller fires, not for cremation but for cursing. They burned neem leaves and hair clippings, chanting the Rani's name backwards until their throats bled. Superstition claimed such rites could unmake a soul. Vigilata heard them anyway, through latticed windows and layers of silk, a lullaby of hatred she welcomed like a lover. Envoys arrived at dawn beneath a flag of parley. Their robes, once white, were now streaked with soot and panic. They carried cedar boxes lined with salt, offerings of surrender. She had the boxes opened in the throne hall, revealing not tribute but a single lock of silver hair, her mother's, taken from the tomb the enemy had desecrated weeks earlier. The hall fell silent except for the soft pop of cooling fat still dripping outside. Rani Vigilata descended the 7 steps from her throne. Barefoot, she walked across the hair, grinding it into the mosaic until each strand split. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same hush as embers before they whirl into sparks. "Tell your king," she said, "that mothers understand fire better than warriors. Tell him I have only begun to teach." Flames licked the midnight sky like the tongues of vengeful gods. 5,000 men, husbands, fathers, sons, cried out in a single, broken chorus as the firestorm consumed them. Their voices rose, then cracked, then fell into silence. Not even the wind dared carry their names beyond the ridge. Queen Morwyn stood atop the battlements of Caer Drakethorn, her silhouette a black wound against the Inferno. She wore no crown, only soot and blood. Her silver hair, once the pride of bards, now clung to her face, in wet, singed ropes. She watched the last of the rebellion burn, and her eyes reflected nothing. Not triumph, not grief, just endless, depthless hunger. They had called her the Winter Widow once, back when she still wept. Before the frost took her tears. Before the council slit her brother's throat in the throne room and dared her to blink. She blinked. Then she smiled. And 3 nights later, every conspirator woke with their tongues blackened and their heirs missing. No one called her widow again. The rebellion had marched under banners of gold and crimson, led by Lord Howrick, the last man who believed honor could still win a war. He'd sent her a letter, sealed in wax and pride, demanding she kneel. She sent him back his youngest son's ring, still warm, still bleeding. That was the moment the war stopped being politics and became folklore. Now Howrick knelt anyway. Not in surrender, but in fire. The oil had been poured at dusk, treacherous and patient, into the narrow valley his army camped in. Morwyn's archers waited until the moon vanished behind smoke-heavy clouds. Then came the first arrow, just one, its tip wrapped in pitch. It landed in a supply cart. The fire spread like a secret, like a sin, like something ancient and patient finally remembering it was alive. Men clawed at each other to escape. Horses screamed louder than men. The valley became a forge. Armor melted into flesh, flesh into air, and above it all, the queen watched. They say her laughter was the last thing the dying heard. Not cruel, not kind, just final. But even as the fire roared, something shifted in the wind. A whisper from the east. Not wind, not voice. A name. A child's name. Her daughter. The one she'd lost to poison years ago. The one she never found. The one she built this kingdom of ash to avenge. And for the first time since the first betrayal, Morwyn's hand trembled. Not from regret, but from memory. Because she knew what came next. Not peace. Not justice. Just the next fire. And the next. Until she burned the world down to its bones, or until the bones remembered how to bite. Below, the flames began to die. Above, the stars refused to shine. Somewhere in the dark, a raven took flight, and the queen turned her back on the dead, already thinking of the living who still needed to burn. The stench of charred flesh hung over the desert for weeks. Caravans took wide detours around the blackened patch where 5,000 men had once marched in perfect formation. Ravens grew so fat they could barely fly. Jackals fought over bones that still wore scraps of silk and steel. Back in the capital, the queen never spoke of what she'd done. She sat beneath her pomegranate trees, fingers stained crimson from the fruit, watching the horizon as if expecting her victims to rise from the sand and seek their revenge. Servants whispered that she heard their screams each night, 5,000 voices calling her name through the smoke that never seemed to leave her dreams. Her own people, began to fear her. Mothers hushed children with the queen's name instead of tales of monsters. Young warriors who'd once boasted of serving her now crossed themselves when her shadow fell across their path. The empire she'd spent 20 years building started crumbling at the edges, province by province. Who would fight for a ruler who'd turned her enemies into candles? In the 11th month, when the first winter winds swept down from the mountains, they found her. Not her enemies, she'd left none alive to tell the tale, but her own reflection. She'd taken to walking the palace halls at midnight, torch in hand, searching each polished bronze mirror for some sign that she remained human. The woman staring back wore her face, but held death in her eyes. The fire that had consumed 5,000 men had hollowed her out too. Where once ambition burned, only ashes remained. Where love might have lived, only the memory of smoke. She'd become the very thing she'd fought against, a monster wearing human skin, ruling through terror instead of wisdom. On the anniversary of that terrible day, she climbed the highest tower alone. Below, her city sprawled in darkness, each lamp a reminder of the flames she'd summoned. The desert stretched beyond, endless and unforgiving, concealing beneath its sands the evidence of her wrath. 5,000 men who'd only wanted to go home to their wives and children. 5,000 stories ended in a single heartbeat. Some say she threw herself from that height. Others insist she simply walked into the desert, shedding her crown and her name like a snake shedding its skin. The truth died with her, as so many truths do when power and terror collide. Today, traders speak of a woman they see sometimes on the horizon, barefoot, dressed in rags, walking the dunes with 5,000 shadows at her back. They say if you get close enough, you can hear her whispering apologies to the wind. But the desert keeps its secrets, and the ashes of 5,000 men have long since blown away. All that remains is a warning carved in stone where her palace once stood. Here ruled a queen who loved her people so much, she destroyed anyone who threatened them. Here died 5,000 sons. Here ended the reign of fire. The letters are worn nearly smooth now. Soon even they will fade. But the desert remembers everything. The flames that rose from Khorasan painted the night sky in shades of orange and crimson, a terrible aurora that would haunt the dreams of survivors for 3 generations. Within the city walls, 5,000 men learned what Olga had known since childhood. Fire is the only witness that never forgets. Their screams built into a chorus that drowned out the crackling timber, a symphony of suffering conducted by the woman who stood outside the gates with her hair unbound, purple robes catching sparks like stars. History would call her Saint Olga, would build golden domes over her bones, and tell children she brought Christianity to a pagan land. The truth lay smoldering in the ashes of Khorasan, where bone fragments still bore the marks of chains, where the earth remained barren for 100 years, because nothing grows where vengeance has planted its seeds. Her great-grandson Vladimir would indeed convert the kingdom, baptizing his people in the Dnieper's waters. But the river remembered what it carried, charred flesh and melted armor drifting toward the Black Sea. 3 years after Khorasan, Olga died in her bed at age 53. She'd spent those final years building churches beside mass graves, commissioning icons that depicted her holding a cross in one hand while the other remained hidden behind her back, fingers still curled around the memory of flame. The priests who sang her funeral hymns spoke of forgiveness, but the old women who'd watched their daughters taken, their husbands broken, knew better. They brought oil lamps to her tomb and left them burning, small flames that spoke the language she understood. Svyatoslav, her wolf-eyed son, expanded the kingdom to the edges of the known world, but he never forgot the lesson his mother taught with fire and patience. When his own turn came to die, ambushed by Pecheneg raiders, his skull made into a drinking cup, those who found his body noticed something strange. Around his neck hung a small glass vial filled with ash, labeled in Greek, "From Khorasan, where my mother taught the world to fear widows." The kingdom Olga forged with blood and fire became Russia, vast and merciless, shaped by winters and war. But in every village square, beside every church dedicated to Saint Olga, the grandmothers still tell the real story to wide-eyed children. They speak of the woman who learned that some wounds never close, that forgiveness is just another word for surrender, and that the hottest fires burn in the coldest hearts.